grid are you really? Jonah tried to go off the grid one time, didn't he? How'd that work out for Jonah? You can't go off the grid with God. And I believe that's what some of these things are. Some of these people are. They're trying to get off the grid with God and the rest of it. And Jonah proved that you can't do that once, but you can run, but you can't hide. And earthly wisdom may help you live in simplicity, but earthly wisdom will never allow one to live in godly sincerity, because earthly wisdom doesn't understand godliness. And the only way to do that is by the grace of God. Now, let's see, what do we have? All right. So our conscience is clear about our behavior in this world. And I don't want to delve real deep into that, but your conscience can be a couple of things. It can be trained and it can be seared. Paul said that he lived, before he became a Christian, he lived in all good conscience towards God. But when he was wrong, he saw that when he saw that he was wrong, he needed to retrain his conscience that would live in accordance with God. So he had to change his whole paradigm of how he thought religion in this world was going to be. And fortunately for us, he had a heart that allowed him to do that. He let God take over and retrain him, so to speak. So those two things, in simplicity and godly sincerity, what a goal to strive for. What a goal to strive for. And then he says this, we're not writing to you anything other than what you read and understand, and I hope you will fully understand, just as you did partially understand us, that on the day of our Lord Jesus, you will boast or rejoice of us as we will boast or rejoice of you. What I take that to mean is you can understand, at least partially understand, what Paul's writing when you read it, what they've said and what they've preached. Your conscience pretty well knows when you're doing right or wrong, if it's been trained properly. So there's no fine print here that has like a disclaimer at the bottom of the page. There's no footnotes or hidden, well, we have footnotes on a lot of them, but man put them there. Paul didn't. There's no hidden agenda in his writing. How you can read stuff sometimes from men and you're thinking, you know, where are they going with this? We got a little copy of the Farmer's Almanac, Old Farmer's Almanac, and it's amazing. You read it 20 years ago and you read it today, the whole tone of it's changed. You can tell that there's an agenda of climate change is affecting this world and how it's doing that. They're meeting in Europe in this last kind of conference thing to try to reduce the amount of meat that Americans are eating because we're eating too many cows. We need to reduce the number of cows because there's too much methane going into the air from the cows. Joey and I were talking about the glaciers melting back in the 1700s. Well, there wasn't any cars around in the 1700s. So what caused the glaciers to melt? There was a lot of cows. Maybe that's what it was. But anyway, there's no hidden agenda. When you read Paul's writings, it's all God focused. It's all godly sincerity, godly living focused. How do we survive in this world? Not according to human wisdom or earthly wisdom, because that's going to lead us to death. We need to live and survive in this world by godly wisdom. And when I read that, I thought, Bill is always saying, it says what it means, and it means what it says. That's just kind of straight up and right. We do in communication, human communication, use various forms of speech to attempt to make things simple and clear to an audience that the communication is intended. But remember that Jesus said the meaning of parables was hidden to those who didn't want to believe his message, who did believe his message, that he was the Messiah. I think about that when I read. If I'm not understanding it, maybe it's because I'm trying to figure it out from human wisdom. You know, what does that mean in this world? How does that benefit me in this world? Instead of, how's that going to benefit me in the next life? And, you know, I'm not living this life for today. I'm living this life for heaven. And that's what Paul, I think, is saying here. He knows that they partially understood what he was saying to them. By the time the Lord shows up, that they will have fully understood. What follows in this discourse of 15 through 24 in chapter 1 is a discussion about Paul changing his plans to make another visit to Corinth. And that upset them, I guess. Mostly it sounds like it has to do with what was going on between him and them, the different communication they have. We just have the first Corinthian letter and the second Corinthian letter, which we know weren't the first and second letters that he ever wrote. We know there was communication going on here. So some of this, I believe, because it's hard to decipher what it is, who's doing what. But there are some things that I think that we can glean from this. Verse 17. When I make plans, do I do so according to the flesh, or am I led by God's Spirit? I kind of paraphrased that one. Was I vacillating when I wanted to do this? Do I make my plans according to the flesh, ready to say yes, yes, and no, no at the same time? And then he goes on down there. But I got to thinking about that. How do I make my plans? How big or small does an action have to be before we consider what God would want us to do or not to do? Can you think of an Old Testament example of that? I thought about Joshua and the nation when they went in defeating Jericho. How big of a deal was that? I mean, they had to march around there for a week, and then the whole entire walls and everything fell down. Then the next city that they had to go to was Ai. And they didn't consult God on it because they said, Ai is just a little old village. We don't need but 3,000 or 4,000 men to go up there and do that. It's just a little thing. McNeese ran up against Alabama. But I mean, they got their tail handed to them because they didn't consult God before they made their plans. They thought, this is just a little thing. We can just go ahead and do this. What's that? We can do it on our own. Yeah. And they didn't consult God ahead of time. And so that got me to thinking, do I consider God spirit and godly living and the things that God would want me to do when I plan my vacation? Where am I going to worship while I'm on vacation? Or why am I going to this place? Do I consider God's spirit when I plan my wardrobe and what I'm wanting to wear? Or even my weekly activities. A lot of times, and I find out more so now that I'm retired, are they me oriented, God oriented? I mean, we talked about this on Wednesday. God doesn't mind if you go fishing. He might if you go fishing on a Sunday instead of meeting with the brethren. He might if you make excuses. Well, it's a nice day and we don't get too many nice days. So, or I can't be at Bible class because I stayed up too late last night playing video games and I'm tired this morning and I'm just going to sleep in. If I'm truly led by God's Spirit, then little details may be important. Maybe I'm just overthinking things. But I know this, motive matters. God knows what your heart is. And if you're really honest with yourself, you know what your heart is. Am I trying to be like Paul and live in simplicity and godly sincerity with a clear conscience? Or am I just trying to keep up appearances so the people around me will like me and think I'm good? It looks the same on the outside, but it's the motive that matters. It's where your heart really is going to. And so I know I'm gleaning a lot of that out of what Paul just said in one little verse, but a lot of this is stuff that just if you read through when you're studying, you catch things like that, little things that you can apply your life to and that affect your life, even though he's talking about the way that he made his plans with them and they're upset because he didn't come when he said he was going to come, but now he's going to explain why. And all of that goes into how he made his plans. That we look at his tours or his missions that he went on, the different journeys that he went on. I know when we went to China, we visited usually about 14 to 18 cities in the 3 weeks that we were there. That took some planning because we didn't put up advertisements and we didn't let very many people know we were coming to a town. It was all of the people that were there from the last time or the time before that met there that got their friends together and would meet us in a hotel. It took a lot of planning. We had facilitators, people that would find us places to meet. We had connectors. Those were the most important people. The people, because you didn't know who to trust, people that knew people who they could trust to invite there so that they weren't inviting government spies in or something like that. We had the teachers, of course, and then we had the planners that did out reservations ahead of time. I couldn't read a menu even at McDonald's because it's all in Chinese. So there was a lot of people that went into us being able to make our plans ahead of time and plan where we were going. And then there was always the possibility that the police would be there and we'd have to change our plans. So Paul didn't make his plans just willy-nilly. He prayed about them a lot, I'm sure. He had insight that, with miraculous gifts that maybe we don't have, but we have the scripture and we can see how we need to plan out our day, from the morning. What am I going to do this morning? He didn't want to make another painful, starting in verse, where is that? We're starting in chapter 2. That's why I'm on the wrong chapter. I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you. Just the wording of that. Some teachers are going to speculate on when Paul made what visit and what pain he caused to whom. But as Joey said in his talk the other night, that's just picking things out of the air. There was some visits here and some communication here that we don't know about. But what is evident is that Paul did not want to make painful visits to them, much like our parents don't want to make painful visits to the woodshed with us. Now, I realize probably 2 over here don't know exactly what I just said. But in other words, Paul wants to visit them and rejoice with them. He doesn't want to visit them and have to do a lot of painful disciplining and setting them straight. That's the way I took all of this. There does seem to be one individual that has caused all this pain and sorrow by his actions, and the congregation has punished him somehow. It also seems he must have repented because Paul instructs them to forgive him and comfort him so that he would not be swallowed up with over excessive sorrow. So Paul begged them to reaffirm their love for him. I've read all of the commentaries and things that say this is the guy he was talking about in the first chapter that had it, or the first letter that had his father's wife, and maybe that's true. But he talked about making another painful visit to them, which means he'd already made one painful visit to them. And I don't think that was the first visit. The first visit wasn't really painful. The second visit must have been. And now he doesn't want to make another painful visit. So we're talking about more than 2 visits. But he didn't make it because he wanted to talk about going to Macedonia, or sailing to them and then going to Macedonia and then coming back through there. So when we look in the back of our Bible and we see a map of Paul's travels, interesting, we'll talk about this a little bit later, that the third missionary journey in Europe only takes up 2 verses. He went there and he came back. And that's all Luke has to say about that. But we all know what it means to reaffirm their love for somebody who's repented. If one in our congregation sins very publicly and we turn our backs on them, so to speak, because of what they've done, but they repent and ask for forgiveness from God and from us, we need to reaffirm our original love for that one. And it's hard once somebody has broken trust, because men will always watch the crack. You can patch things back up, but men will always be looking for the crack. Paul saying, don't do that. Reaffirm that original love that you had for him, just as though that never happened, because that's the way God does. He puts that in the far as the east is from the west, puts that sin away when it's been repented of. And so we're right back into a good relationship. Dividing and conquering is one of Satan's devices. When he talks about we're not unaware of what Satan's devices are, dividing and conquering is one of them. Backbiting and gossiping turn into hatred and murder. And so that's as much for that person as for the congregation itself. They needed to reaffirm their love for him. Yeah. And that works too. I mean, how do I say that? Anyway, you explained it better than I did. Of this letter or of the first letter? Oh, the lost letter. Interesting. I had not read that. Yeah. 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 I had not read that before. Another one of those things that tuck back here, and when you're doing your study and you try to remember them. Who was Titus? Yep. You know that he's not mentioned in Acts? Not even once. Paul mentions him 8 times in this letter. Twice in the Galatian letter. And he took him up after 14 years. He took him up to Jerusalem with him. So Titus has been around for a long time. He was left in Crete by Paul to be the evangelist to that island and to appoint elders in every town. I thought that was interesting. I thought, well, everybody knows who Titus was, a preacher. Surely Luke talked about him and going with their travels. Not a word. Anyway, where and how these two verses fit into Paul travels is probably lost to history, because when he starts out in 12, when When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was open for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia. Now in Acts 20 and 2 and 3, we see that he left Ephesus, went to Macedonia, spent 3 months plus in Macedonia and Greece, and came back to Troas. And that's the whole record of Luke's account of Paul's third trip from Antioch, but his second trip to Europe. He only went to Europe twice, according to Luke. But this sounds like he went, more often. So I wasn't too sure how all of that fit. It probably doesn't. It's a kind of like a historical thing and doesn't really have anything to do with what we're learning. So I just went on past that and to the next section. And that was starting in verse 15. The aroma of Christ. Wow. Google that. There has been hundreds, if not maybe more than that, sermons written on this phrase using the text, this part of the text. Google has pages of references. It's first mentioned in Genesis after the flood, when Noah offered a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God, Genesis 8:21, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma from his sacrifice. And I guess that kind of means that peace had finally returned. All of that violence that we saw in chapter 6, men's thoughts being evil continually, all of that was dead and gone. Peace had returned, and the constant violence of chapter 6 was gone. But a pleasing aroma. It has to be figurative, because branding night when I worked for the Wyoming Cattle Company is the most flesh that I've ever smelled burning at one time. The other's leaving your hamburger on your grill too long. But neither of those smells are pleasing, literally. So it has to mean something else, because the literal aroma of burning flesh, I don't think that's what he's talking about, was pleasing to God. What's he talking about? That aroma means that you're sacrificing, supposed to mean you're sacrificing the best of what you have. Yep. Our service to God, our sacrifice. Paul talked about in the first letter, our service doesn't mean a whole lot unless what? It's rooted in what? I'm sorry? Heart, love. That's what Paul talked about in chapter 13. I can speak in 1,000 different tongues, but unless I have love, it doesn't do any good. I can burn myself in the flames, sacrifice my body to the burning of the flame, but unless I have love, I just got burned up. So it sounds like Paul's about to go into a defensive mode, and he restates, as he did in chapter 1, how he lived in this world with simplicity and godly sincerity. Here he says that we weren't peddlers, we weren't preacher peddlers like some are, but they were men of sincerity as being commissioned by God. And then he introduces the word sufficient here and asks the question, sufficient for these things? Apparently, they didn't think that he was sufficient to be able to tell them what to do. Who is sufficient for these things, Paul asks. And I don't know if he's asking that as a rhetorical question or trying to get them to think. Kind of got ahead of myself. That aroma is two different aromas. It's the smell of life to people that believe what Paul's saying and what God has said, and that Paul is from God and that he's telling them how they should live. And the other aroma is from death to death for people that are unbelievers that refuse to go along with that. That's the aroma that they're preaching, that they preach. That's the aroma of death to those people. So what are letters of recommendation? You ever had to have a letter of recommendation? You ever written a letter of recommendation? I think to get into one of the academies, the military academies, you have to have a letter of recommendation from your senator. They're testimonies from others as to a person's qualifications or character or whatever is included. Apparently, the number of papers that have been written on the subject, they were used in the first century Greco-Roman world. Letters had to be sent because, this is a new covenant. I don't know that preacher. He's saying stuff that I've never heard before. How do I know he's telling me the truth? Well, with the apostles, they came with the Spirit. They came with gifts of the Spirit. They performed miracles. They performed things that other men couldn't do. They had letters of recommendation from God. And so the people could see, well, that's pretty good. That must be true. But then Apollos comes along and he's teaching and he's refuting the Jews and things like that, but he's not an apostle. So he doesn't have any of this other confirmation. They had a really difficult time, the church, the people of the congregation, I think, had just a very difficult time. Okay. We're probably not going to get into the rest of this because we're about out of time, even though whoever's preaching today can probably go on till midnight because that clock still says only 9:45, but it's quarter after. And next week we'll start with what Paul was referring to when he said, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. We're going to get into a discussion about where God's law is written. And any questions or comments on what we did? I still have so many questions, I don't know if I have an answer. Yeah. What I was talking about, that pleasant aroma One, we know that it doesn't, that's literally not possible. And yet God is everywhere, so his nose could smell it too, I guess. But I believe that that's telling us that it's our service, our sacrifice. It's the type of sacrifice that we're making, because they had made sacrifices that he wasn't pleased with. We can do the same. We can make sacrifices that are all intended to help us out and not intended to show our love for God. Yes, Larry. I'll be. I did not know that. All right. Well, I'm sorry I didn't turn on the other speaker. I know you can hear me, but I think this one down here is supposed to be for those cameras up there. And I just now realized that I had left it off the whole time. I didn't see anybody hollering and waving back there, so thank you all. We'll pick up in chapter 3.